Introduction to the Philosophy of History by George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. (1) The Methods of History. The philosophic history of the world. This is the subject of these lectures. Thus, we do not aim to draw from history any general reflections on it, nor to elucidate it with examples from its own content. Rather, our concern is with world history itself. Footnote: I can provide no textbook as a basis for this subject, but in my Philosophy of Right, paragraphs 341 to 360, I have presented the more precise concept of such a world history, along with the principles and periods that go into the consideration of it. End of footnote. Before going any farther, we ought to clarify just what this is. To do so, we must go through the other methods of dealing with history. Altogether, there are three. 1. Original history. 2. Reflective history. 3. Philosophic history. 1. For the first of these, certain names will immediately conjure up a distinct picture of what I mean. Thus, Herodotus, Thucydides, and other such historians primarily describe the actions, events, and situations they themselves have witnessed, and whose spirit they shared in. They translate what is externally present into the realm of mental representation, thereby bringing the outer into the inner, just as the poet works up the stuff of his own sensation into images for our minds. Of course, such original historians rely on the reports and accounts of others, since it is not possible for one person to have seen everything. But they use these sources as ingredients only, just as the poet already possesses the civilized speech to which he owes so much. These historians bind together what is vanishing down the stream of time, and place it all in the temple of memory to give it immortality. Legends, folk songs, traditions. These are to be excluded from original history, because they are obscure modes of memory, proper to the mentality of pre-illiterate peoples. On the contrary, in original history, we are concerned with peoples who knew what they were and what they wanted. The foundation of observed and observable reality provides a firmer ground than the transient soil in which legends and epics have grown. These no longer make up the historic record of those peoples that have risen to a firm individuality. These original historians, then, transform the events, actions, and situations present to them into works of representation. The content of these histories therefore cannot be of great external scope. Think of Herodotus in his Persian Wars, Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War, Guicciardini in his history of Italy, 1536. Their essential material is what is present and alive in their surrounding world. The culture of the author and of the events in his work, the spirit of the author and of the action he tells of are one and the same. He describes, more or less, what he has seen, or at least lived through. Short spans of time, the individual patterns of men and events. These are the singular, unreflected features out of which he composes his portrait of the time, in order to bring that picture to posterity with as much clarity as it had in its own direct observation, or in the accounts of other direct witnesses. He is not concerned with offering reflections on these events, for he lives within the spirit of the times, and cannot as yet transcend them. And if the author, like Caesar, belongs to the class of military leaders or statesmen, then it is his goals themselves that are the topic of his history. We say that such a historian is not reflective, but that persons and nations themselves are directly present in his history. Yet against this, there are the speeches, which we can read, for example, in Thucydides. These were surely not spoken as they are represented, but were worked up by the writer of the history. Speeches, however, are actions among men, and indeed they are effective actions in their very essence. Of course, people often say that there were mere speeches, and in so saying, they want to show the innocuous nature of mere talk. But that talk is mere babble, and babble has the important advantage of being innocuous itself. But the speeches of nations to nations, or to nations and princes, are integral components of history. If such speeches, as for example those of Pericles, the most profoundly learned, the most genuine and noble statesman, are surely worked up by Thucydides, they are at least not alien to Pericles. In these speeches, the speakers express the maxims held by their people, their own personality, their awareness of the political situation, as well as their moral and spiritual nature, and their principles, aims, and modes of action. What the original historian presents as their speech is not a borrowed consciousness, but the speaker's own culture. If one wishes to immerse oneself in the life of other nations, there are historians one must study deeply and devote time to. But there are not as many of them as one might think. They are not the historians one might go to, not only for erudition, but for deep and genuine enjoyment. We have already mentioned Herodotus, the father, i.e., the originator of history, as well as Thucydides. Xenophon's The Persian Expedition is an equally original book. Caesar's commentaries are the simple masterwork of a great mind. In antiquity, these historians necessarily were great captains and statesmen. In the Middle Ages, it was the bishops who were at the center of political activity, but it was the monks who wrote history in the form of naive chronicles, and who were as isolated from events as the men of antiquity were involved in them. In modern times, all this has changed. Our culture is essentially intellectual, and it immediately converts all events into reports for intellectual representation. We have some excellent examples of this, simple and exact, especially war reports, which deserve to be set beside those of Caesar, and are even more instructive in their wealth of content and their account of methods and conditions. To these we may add the French memories, written by clever heads about small matters, and containing much in the way of anecdote lacking in historical foundation. Yet often there are true historical masterworks, such as the Memories of Cardinal de Retz, written 1673 to 1676, displaying a greater historical field. In Germany, such masters are rare. Frederick the Great, in his history de mon temps, is a praiseworthy exception. These authors must actually be of high social standing. Only from a superior position can one truly see things for what they are, and see everything, not when one has to peer upward from below through a narrow opening. 2. The second method of writing history we can call the reflective. It is history whose presentation goes beyond the present in spirit, and does not refer to the historian's own time. Here, too, we can distinguish different types. A. Universal history aims in general at an overview of the entire history of a people or a country, or of a world. Here the main thing is the elaboration of the historical material, which the historian approaches with his spirit, this being different from the spirit contained in the content. Especially important are the principles the author sets up for himself, based in part on the content and goals of the actions and events, and in part on the way he constructs the history. With us, Germans, historical writing shows a great variety of reflection and intelligence, each historian taking it into his head to go his own peculiar way. The English and French generally know how history must be written, because they stand more securely on a basis of general and national culture. With us, each one concocts his own peculiar characteristic, and instead of writing history, we keep on looking for the way history ought to be written. The first type of reflective history is linked directly to the foregoing mode, i.e., original history, if it has no other purpose than to present the entire history of a country. Complications of this kind, including histories of Livy, Diodorus, Siculus, and the Swiss histories of Johannes von Müller, in 24 volumes written from 1780 to 1808, are highly commendable, if done well. Certainly, it is best if these historians approach the first mode and write so vividly that the reader can have the impression of hearing the events recounted by contemporaries and eyewitnesses. But the singular tone which an individual must have who belongs to a specific culture often is not adjusted to accord with the times which the history covers, and the spirit that speaks through the author is different from the spirit of the times for which he speaks. Thus Livy lets the kings, consuls, and generals of an older Rome make speeches that are appropriate to a skilled lawyer of his own time, in glaring contrast to the received legends of antiquity, such as the crude fable of Menenius Agrippa. He also gives us descriptions of battles as though he had witnessed them, but the details of these battles might be used to describe the battles of an era, and the definiteness in their description contrasts with the lack of coherence and with the inconsistency dominant in other writings of his. The difference between a compiler like Livy and an original historian such as Polybius can best be seen if we compare the two, and note how Livy makes use of the historical material preserved in Polybius by extending and shortening that material. Similarly, Johannes von Müller in striving to be true to the older times he describes, has given his history a hollow solemnity and a wooden, pedantic appearance. One would much rather read of the same matters in the Swiss chronicles of old Taschudi, who lived 1505 to 1572, where everything is more naive and natural, without the artificial and effective archaism. A history of the kind that surveys long periods or the entire history of the world must in fact give up the individual presentation of particular reality, and make do with summaries and abridgments. It is abstract not only in the sense that events and actions have to be omitted, but in the further sense that thought is the mightiest epitomist. A battle, a great victory, a siege, these are no longer what they were, but instead are drawn together into simple statements. When Livy tells of the wars with the Volsci, he occasionally says, shortly enough, "This year war was waged on the Volsci." B. A second type of reflective history is the pragmatic. When we are occupied with a remote world of the past, that world becomes present to the mind through the mind's own activity, and that recaptured world is the mind's reward for its labor. The events vary, but they are connected into one pattern in their universal and inner meaning. This is what negates the event as past and makes it present. Pragmatic reflections, abstract though they might be, are thus what is in fact present, and they bring the accounts of the past to life in our present-day world. But whether reflections of this kind are really filled with interest and vitality depends on the mind of the author. Here we must also mention, in particular, the moral reflections and moral instruction to be gained from history, when it is worked up for this purpose. While it is true that certain historical examples of goodness may be brought to bear for the moral education of children and the elevation of their minds in order to impress them with what is morally admirable, it is also true that the destinies of nations and states, with their interests, situations, and complexities, are a different field of knowledge. Rulers, statesmen, and nations are told that they ought to learn from the experience of history. Yet what experience and history teach us is this, that nations and governments have never learned anything from history, nor acted in accordance with the lessons to be derived from it. Each era has such particular circumstances, such individual situations, that decisions can only be made from within the era itself. In the press of world events, there is no help to be had from general principles, nor from the memory of similar conditions in former times. For a pale memory has no force against the vitality and freedom of the present. In this respect, nothing is more trite than the repeated appeal to Greek and Roman examples, which was so commonplace at the time of the French Revolution. And no difference could be greater than that between the nature of those ancient peoples and our own time. Footnote. See Hume's Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, Section 8, Part 1. Would you know the sentiments, inclinations, and course of life of the Greeks and Romans? Study well the temper and actions of the French and English. Mankind are so much the same in all times and places that history informs us of nothing new or strange in this particular. End of footnote. Johannes von Müller had moral intentions of this sort in his universal history, as well as in his Swiss history. He aimed to prepare moral lessons for the edification of princes, governments, and nations, particularly for the Swiss. He made his own collection of lessons and reflections, and he often notes in his letters the exact number of reflections he has written out that week. But this cannot be counted as a part of the best things he produced. The only thing that can give truth and interest to reflections is the thoroughgoing, free, and comprehensive view of different situations, and the deep sense of the fundamental idea, as, for example, in Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws. 1748. For this reason, one reflective history supersedes another. Each author has the materials available, so that each can consider himself equally capable of organizing them and working them up, thus validating his own spirit in them as the spirit of the time. That name, of course, being Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws. Wearied of such reflective histories, we all too often resort to the practice of describing an event from every vantage point. Such histories are in any case worth something, but for the most part they merely supply raw material. We Germans are satisfied with this. The French, on the contrary, ingeniously shape the past into a present and relate it to their present situation. C. The third type of reflective history is the critical. It must be brought up here because it is the particular way in which history is treated in Germany at present. What is here presented is not history itself, but a history of historical writing and a critical evaluation of historical accounts, together with an inquiry into their truth and trustworthiness. What is meant to be exceptional here consists in the ingenuity of the author in extorting something new from the historical accounts, not in the things themselves. The French have contributed much that is profound and thoughtful in this field. All the same, they have not sought to validate this critical procedure as historical, but have rather organized their evaluations in the form of critical monographs. Among us Germans, the so-called higher criticism has seized hold not only of philology in general, but of historical literature. This higher criticism has supposedly justified the introduction of all the unhistorical abortions of an empty imagination. This is the other means of achieving reality in history. That is, by putting subjective notions in place of historical data. The bolder these notions are, i.e., the scantier the evidence on which they rest, and the more they contradict the more definite facts of history, the more excellent they are taken to be. D. The final type of reflective history is that which directly presents itself as specialized, i.e., part of the greater whole. Although it does abstract from the whole, it does form a transition to philosophic world history by taking universal viewpoints, e.g., the history of art, of law, or of religion. In our time, this type of conceptual history has been more developed and has been brought into prominence. Branches of this kind are related to the totality that is the history of a people, and the only question is whether the coherence of the totality has been made evident, or has merely been sought in external circumstances. In the latter case, they appear as entirely accidental oddities of different peoples. Accordingly, if reflective history has come to pursue general viewpoints, then we should notice where they are genuine, These viewpoints are not merely the outer thread or the external order, but rather the inner guiding soul of the events and actions. For like Mercury, the conductor of departed souls, the idea is truly the guide of nations of the world, and spirit, as its rational and necessary will, is what guides and has guided the course of events in the world. To recognize it in the way it guides the world is our present aim, and this leads to 3. The third method of history, the philosophic. The two previous methods had no need of clarification, since their concept was self-explanatory. With the third method, however, there does seem to be a need for elucidation or justification. The universal principle, however, is that the term philosophy of history signifies nothing other than the thoughtful consideration of history, that is, the application of philosophic thought to history. We cannot ever give up thinking. That is how we differ from the animals. There is a thinking in our perception, in our cognition, and our intellect, in our drives and our volition, to the extent that these are human. But for that reason, the appeal to thinking may seem unsatisfying here, because in history our thinking is subordinated to the given and to what exists. It has all this as its basis and is governed by it. Philosophy, however, has thoughts of its own brought forth by speculation from within itself and without reference to what is. If the philosopher approaches history with thoughts of this kind, then he is dealing with history as a raw material, not to be left as it is, but to be construed according to thoughts, a priori. Footnote. See Kant's essay, The Idea of a Universal History from a Cosmopolitan Point of View, as an outstanding example of the priori construal of his history that Hegel means. End of footnote. But since history has merely to take in information, i.e. of what is and has been, of events and actions, and since it remains all the truer the more it confines itself to what is given, this approach seems to be in conflict with the proper concern of philosophy. And this contradiction, together with the reproach springing from it in regard to speculation, must here be clarified and resolved. But this is to be done without entering into the many corrections of the infinitely numerous and distorted views now held, or forever being reinvented, regarding the purpose, the interest, and the handling of what is historical and its relation to philosophy. Part 2. Reason in History. The only thought which philosophy brings with it in regard to history is the simple thought of reason, the thought that reason rules the world, and that world history has therefore been a rational in its course. This conviction and insight in the presupposition in regard to history as such, although it is not a presupposition in philosophy itself. In philosophy, speculative reflection has shown that reason is the substance as well as the infinite power, that reason is for itself the infinite material of all natural and spiritual life, as well as the infinite form, and that its actualization of itself is its content. And we can stand by the term reason here without examination its relation and connection with God more closely. Thus reason is the substance of our historic world. in that sense that it is that whereby and wherein all reality has its being and subsistence. It is the infinite power, since reason is not so powerless as to arrive at nothing more than the ideal, the ought, and to remain outside reality, who knows where, as something peculiar in the heads of a few people. Reason is the infinite content, the very stuff of all essence and truth, which it gives to its own activity to be worked up. For, unlike finite activity, it does not need such conditions as an external material, or given means from which to get its nourishment, and the objects of its activity. It lives on itself, and it is itself the material upon which it works. Just as reason is its own presupposition and absolute goal, so it is the activation of that goal in world history, bringing it forth from the inner source to external manifestation, not only in the natural universe, but also in the spiritual. That this idea is the true, the eternal, simply the power, that it reveals itself in the world, and that nothing else is revealed in the world but that idea itself, its glory and majesty. This, as we said, is what has been shown in philosophy, and it is here presupposed as already proven. Those of you who are not yet acquainted with philosophy can at least be expected to come to these lectures on world history with the belief in reason, with the desire, the thirst to know it, and indeed what must be presupposed as the subjective need in the study of the sciences is the desire for rational insight, for knowledge, not merely for a collection of facts. Thus, even if you do not bring to world history the thought and the knowledge of reason, you ought to at least to have the firm and unconquerable belief that there is reason in history, together with the belief that the world of intelligence and self-conscious will is not subject to chance, but rather that it must demonstrate itself in the light of the self-conscious idea. But in fact, I need not require this belief on your part in advance. What I have said so far, and will say again, is not just to be taken as a presupposition of our science, but as a summary of the totality as the result of the discussion upon which we are embarking, a result that is known to me because I already know that totality. Thus, it is the consideration of world history itself that must reveal its rational process, namely, that it has been the rational, necessary course of the world spirit. The spirit, whose nature is indeed always one and the same, but which reveals this one nature in the world's reality. As I said, this must be the outcome of the study of history. Yet we must take history as it is, and proceed historically, i.e., empirically. Among other things, we must not be misled by the professional historians, particularly the Germans, who possess great authority and do precisely what they accuse philosophers of doing, namely creating a priori fabrications in history. For example, there is a widespread fabrication that there existed an original primeval people taught directly by God and having complete insight and wisdom with a penetrating knowledge of all the laws of nature and spiritual truth, or that there were such priestly peoples, or to speak of something more specific, that there was a Roman epic, from which the Roman historians drew their earliest history, and so on. Let us leave all such a priori constructions to the clever professionals, for whom, in Germany, such constructions are not uncommon. As the first condition to be observed, we could therefore declare that we must apprehend the historical faithfully. But with such general terms as apprehend and faithfully, there lies an ambiguity. Even the ordinary, average historian, who believes and says that he is merely receptive to his data, is not passive in his thinking. He brings his categories along with him and sees this data through them. In every treatise that is to be specific, reason must not slumber, and reflection must be actively applied. To him who looks at the world rationally, the world looks rational in return. The relation is mutual. But the various kinds of reflection of possible viewpoints of judgment, even in regard to the mere importance and unimportance of facts, the most basic category in historical judgment, all this does not concern us here. And of course that word fumbled upon a few lines up was ambiguity. In regard to the general conviction that reason rules and has ruled in the world and likewise in world history, I would like to draw your attention to just two versions of that conviction. These will enable us to get closer to the main point, which is so difficult, and at the same time to point ahead to our further discussion. A. To begin with, there is the historical fact that the Greek Anaxagoras was the first to say that nous, understanding in general, or reason, rules the world. Spelt N-O-U-S. By this he did not mean an intelligence as self-conscious reason, or a mind as such. We must take care to differentiate nous and mind from one another. The movement of the solar system follows immutable laws. These laws are its reason, but neither the sun nor the planets that revolve around it, according to these laws, have any consciousness of them. Such a thought, that there is reason in nature, that nature is governed unchangeably by general laws, does not surprise us. We are accustomed to thinking in this way, and we do not make much of it. I have merely mentioned this historical fact to make you aware of what history shows, namely, that a thought which seems trivial to us was not always commonplace in the world, but rather was epoch-making in the history of the human spirit. Aristotle says of Anaxagoras, as the originator of this thought, that he appeared like a sober man among the drunken ones. From Anaxagoras, Socrates took it up, and it immediately became the dominant thought in philosophy, except for the philosophy of Epicurus, which ascribed all events to chance. Plato has Socrates say, I was delighted with this thought, and I was hoping to have found a teacher who would explain nature according to reason, and how in each particular thing its particular purpose as well as the universal purpose in the totality. Not for a great fortune would I have given up this hope, but how disappointed I was when I so eagerly took up the writings of Anaxagoras himself. And I found that he brought into his explanation merely external causes, such as air, the ether, water, and the like, instead of reason. Fiedo, 97c to 98c. We can see that what Socrates found so unsatisfying in the principle of Anaxagoras was not the principle itself, but rather Anaxagoras's failure to apply it to concrete nature. That this nature was not understood or conceived on the basis of that principle, but that principle was held to be something abstract. Nature was not grasped as a development of reason, not as an organic whole brought forth by reason. At the very outset, therefore, I want to call your attention to the difference between maintaining a conception, a principle, a truth in a merely abstract way, and carrying it through to a fuller determination and a concrete development. This difference, i.e., between the abstract and the concrete, is basic to all philosophy as well. Thus, at the end of our discussion of world history, we shall be returning to this point especially in dealing with the most recent political situation. B. The second version of the thought that reason rules the world is related to a further application of it, with which we are well acquainted, in the form of the religious truth that the world is not subject to chance and to external contingencies, but that it is ruled by a providence. I explained earlier that I do not wish to make any demands on your belief in this principle of providence. Yet I might appeal to your belief in it in this religious form, if that is the distinctive character of the science of philosophy allowed presuppositions to count at all. To put it in another way, the appeal to your belief is not necessary, because the science we wish to discuss will itself prove the proof of the correctness of that principle, if not the proof of its truth. The truth, then, that there is a divine providence presiding over the events of the world corresponds to the stated principle, for divine providence is wisdom with infinite power, realizing its own ends, i.e., the absolute rational end goal of the world, while reason is thought quite freely determining itself. But now we also see a difference emerging. There is indeed a contradiction between this belief in providence and our principle, rather like the difference between the dictum of Anaxagoras and the expectations of Socrates in regard to it. That belief in a providence is indefinite in the same way. It does not advance to any definite conclusion, as applied to the totality of things and to the all-encompassing course of world history. To explain history, however, means to reveal the passions of human beings, their talents, their active powers. This definiteness of providence is what is usually taken for its plan, yet it is this very plan that is supposed to be hidden from our view, so that we would be presumptuous to want to understand it. The ignorance of Anaxagoras as to how reason manifests itself in reality was sincere. The awareness of that thought, whether in him or in Greece in general, had not yet gone any further. He could not yet apply his principle to the concrete events and understand concrete reality in terms of that principle. It was Socrates who took the first step towards grasping the union of the concrete with the universal. Anaxagoras, therefore, was not explicitly opposed to such an application of the universal to the concrete, but the belief in providence is opposed at least to the large-scale application of the principle and our comprehending the plan of providence. Here and there, in particular cases, the application is allowed. Pious souls see in certain individual events not merely the workings of chance, but of God's hand, for example, when an individual in great distress and need receives help unexpectedly. But these purposes themselves are of a restricted sort, for they are only the particular purposes of this individual. In world history, however, we are concerned with individuals that are nations, with wholes that are states. Accordingly, we cannot stop at the, so to speak, retail version of the belief in providence. Still less can we be content with the merely abstract, indefinite belief which goes only so far as the general view that there is a providence, and says nothing of its more definite acts. On the contrary, we must seriously try to recognize the ways of providence and to connect its means and manifestations in history, relating these to that universal principle. But in mentioning the possibility of our knowing the plan of divine providence in general, I have touched on a question that has become prominent in our own time, the question about the possibility of our knowing God, or inasmuch as it has ceased to be a question, there is the doctrine, which has now become a prejudice, that it is impossible to know God. Holy Scripture commands it as our highest duty not only to love God, but also to know God. But in direct opposition to this, there now prevails the denial of what is there written, that it is the Spirit that leads us to truth, that the Spirit knows all things, and penetrates even to the depths of the Godhead. Footnote. See 1 Corinthians 2:10. God has revealed these things to us through the Spirit, for the Spirit searches all things, even the depths of God. End of footnote. When the divine being is placed beyond the reach of our knowing and beyond human affairs altogether, we gain the convenience of indulging in our own imaginings. We are thereby excused from having to give our knowledge some relation to the divine and the true. On the contrary, the vanity of human knowledge and subjective feeling receives a complete justification for itself. And when pious humility places the knowing of God at a distance, it knows full well what it has thereby gained for its arbitrariness and vain efforts. I could not avoid mentioning the connection between the thesis that reason rules the world and has ruled it, and the question about the possibility of our knowing God, since I did not want to dodge the accusation that philosophy shuns or must shun all discussions of religious truths, that is, due to a bad conscience about them. On the contrary, in modern times we have come to the point where philosophy has to take up the defense of religious truths against many types of theological doctrine. In the Christian religion, God has revealed himself. That is to say, he has allowed human beings to understand what he is, so that he is no longer hidden and secret. With this possibility of our knowing God, the obligation to know him is placed upon us. God wants no narrow-minded souls and empty heads for his children. Rather, he wants those who, however poor in spirit, are rich in the knowledge of him, and who place the highest value in his knowledge of him. The development of the thinking spirit, which began from this basis in the revelation of the divine being, must finally come to the point where what was originally present only to feeling and to the imagining spirit can now be grasped by thought. And the time must finally come when we comprehend the rich product of creative reason, that is, world history. For some time it was customary to admire God's wisdom at work in animals, in plants, and in the destinies of individuals. If we grant that providence reveals itself in such objects and materials, then why not also in world history? Here the material seems too great, yet the divine wisdom, i.e., reason, is one and the same on the large scale and on the small. We must not consider God to be too weak to apply his wisdom on a large scale. In our knowledge, we aim for the insight that whatever was intended by the eternal wisdom has come to fulfillment, as in the realm of nature, so in the realm of spirit that is active and actual in the world. To that extent, our approach is a theodicy, a justification of the ways of God. Leibniz attempted a theodicy in metaphysical terms, using indefinite abstract categories, so that when once the evil in the world was comprehended in this way, the thinking mind was supposed to be reconciled to it. Nowhere, in fact, is there a greater challenge to such intellectual reconciliation than in world history. This reconciliation can be achieved only through the recognition of that positive aspect, in which the negative disappears as something subordinate and overcome. It is attained, on the one hand, through the awareness of the true end goal of the world, and on the other, through the awareness that this end has been actualized in the world and that the evil has not prevailed in it in any ultimate sense. For this purpose, however, the mere belief in nous, N-O-U-S, and providence is still quite inadequate. Reason, which is said to rule the world, is just as indefinite a term as providence. We hear reason spoken of, without anyone being able to say just what its definition is, or its content, according to which we could judge whether something is rational or irrational. To grasp reason, in its definition, that is of primary importance. If we merely stick to the bare term reason, throughout the rest of what we say is just words. With these declarations behind us, we can go on to the second viewpoint we wish to consider in this introduction.